The first time I understood my husband and his mother were trying to erase me. I was standing 10 feet from a 12-foot projection screen displaying the founding family of the Vale Foundation. My husband was in the photo. His mother was in the photo. Even the woman who handled their donor correspondence twice a week was in the photo. I was not. And I was the one who had built half the foundation's operating structure from my dining room table, while Bennett still thought donor cultivation meant smiling near expensive flowers and letting me fix the parts that leaked. That was the moment I knew this wasn't neglect. It was revision. The gala was being held at Marlowe House. One of those old museums rich people rent when they want charity to look like inheritance. Marble stairs. Black tie waitstaff. Gold lights spilling over portraits of dead industrialists who probably destroyed whole towns and then had libraries named after them. The air smelled like champagne. Orchids. And the kind of quiet money that teaches people to call cruelty taste. I was standing beside a pillar near the east wall in a midnight blue gown I had paid for myself, staring at the screen while the donor reel turned through staged photographs and carefully edited captions. The Legacy of the Vale Family. That was the title card. Not the Vale Foundation team. Not our founding board. Not even the people who made this work possible. The Legacy of the Vale Family. And somehow, according to the screen, 30 feet high above a room full of trustees, press, and major donors, I had never existed inside it. Bennett's mother, Lucinda Valli, was at the center of every frame. Of course she was. Lucinda wore power the way some women wear diamonds. Daily, strategically, and always with the intention of making other women feel underdressed in her presence. She had silver hair swept perfectly away from her face, a spine like a dueling sword, and the kind of smile that could make a waiter feel like a servant and a senator feel briefly chosen. She was standing near the stage in ivory silk, one hand resting lightly on Bennett's arm, speaking to a donor couple from Connecticut as if she were royalty reluctantly tolerating republics. My husband looked magnificent, which used to make me proud. That part shames me now, because for years I mistook polish for worth. Bennett had that glossy East Coast ease that makes weak men look capable in public. Tailored tuxedo, clean jawline, calm voice, the kind of face donors trust because it seems born to the architecture. But almost everything in that room that actually worked grant compliance. Scholarship disbursement, vendor restructuring, the educational outreach calendar, the youth housing partnership, the digital donor migration after the old CRM collapsed had passed through my hands first. Not his. Mine. And still, on that screen, I was air. The reel shifted. A photo of Lucinda cutting a ribbon. A photo of Bennett beside a podium. A photo of the founding circle at a luncheon 3 years ago, cropped tightly enough that no one could see I had been standing at the edge of the original frame, holding the event binder after fixing the seating disaster his mother caused by insulting one of the city councilman's wives. Then came the line that split the night in half, built on generations of vision, discipline, and family stewardship. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not loudly. Not enough for anyone to turn. But enough for me to hear what it sounded like when disbelief curdled into clarity. Generations of vision. I had written the first grant language that got the foundation recognized beyond Lucinda's vanity luncheons. I had built the scholarship scoring rubric. I had reorganized the emergency housing fund after discovering Bennett had been approving flashy photo op donations while ignoring the quiet cases that actually kept women and children off the street. I had spent 4 years taking a social trophy foundation and turning it into a functioning civic institution. And now they were telling the room it had all descended naturally from bloodline. That was when Naomi Sloan found me. Naomi was our former communications consultant, former because I had quietly stopped renewing her contract once I realized Lucinda only wanted communications when communications could be used as upholstery for ego. Naomi had the watchful face of a woman who makes a living spotting lies before they harden into brand assets. She followed my gaze to the screen. Then, very quietly, I said, "They removed you from the archive deck." Not forgot. Not left you out. Removed. That word landed exactly where it needed to. Because suddenly, 100 little humiliations snapped into alignment. The board packet last month that referred to me as Bennett's spouse liaison instead of operations director. The donor newsletter draft where my quote about program accountability vanished before publication. Lucinda's little correction at lunch 2 weeks earlier when a trustee thanked me for building the scholarship arm. And she smiled and said, Corinne does love to help Bennett execute the family vision. Help Bennett execute. That was how they had been doing it. Softly. Elegantly. One reduction at a time. Until tonight. When the reductions had finally become visible enough to be undeniable. I should tell you, I confronted them immediately. I didn't. That's what they expected. A scene. A wife upset near a projection screen. Something Bennett could sigh over, and Lucinda could absorb with frosted patience, before privately calling me unstable and publicly calling me tired. No. I had spent too many years around that family not to recognize a trap when it was lit with gold chandeliers. So I did what they had never learned to fear enough. I went quiet. Not wounded quiet. Operational quiet. I watched the screen finish its lie. I watched Lucinda lift her glass to the next donor table. I watched Bennett laugh with his hand resting over the foundation crest embroidered on the event program. As if Heritage had personally chosen him for stewardship. And as I stood there beneath that monstrous projection of their edited history, I understood something so clean it almost felt merciful. They thought they were erasing me from the gala. What they had actually done was create a public record of the lie. And once people like Lucinda and Bennett give me a record, they have already lost. They started treating me like decoration the moment the foundation became successful enough to attract serious money. That is the simplest way to say it. Before the grants got larger, before the board expanded, before Lucinda Vale began speaking about intergenerational stewardship as if she had personally invented sacrifice in a silk blouse, I was useful in visible ways. Bennett used to bring me into donor meetings because I could answer real questions. He used to forward my budget summaries without editing my name off them. He used to say things like, Corinne built the model that made this possible. Usually late at night. Usually in private. Usually when he needed me softened enough to keep working. That changed the minute public credit became something worth protecting. The Vale Foundation had started as what most old family foundations actually are, a polished tax shelter with occasional scholarships attached, so nobody asks too many structural questions. Lucinda hosted luncheons. Bennett shook hands. There were photos. Flowers. And just enough low-risk generosity to keep the family crest associated with grace instead of appetite. Then I got involved. Not because anyone asked beautifully. Because I couldn't stand watching preventable incompetence parade itself as benevolence. The first year I only meant to streamline things. I audited their scholarship criteria. Found them vague enough to privilege photogenic hardship over actual need. And rebuilt the evaluation process from scratch. I rewrote their grant compliance system after discovering they were 6 weeks away from a reporting failure that could have cost them state credibility. I created internal tracking for emergency disbursements, because Lucinda kept approving donor-visible gestures, while families who actually needed rent stabilization were falling through administrative cracks. None of that was glamorous. That is why none of it interested Bennett until it started working. And once it started working, it began attracting the kind of people Lucinda valued most: institutional donors, city partnerships, our regional press, politicians with cameras, board members who cared more about measurable outcomes than tasteful napkin rings. That should have made me safer. Instead, it made me dangerous to them, because the foundation's new legitimacy had my fingerprints all over it. And bloodline families can tolerate a competent outsider only until the outsider becomes easier to trace than the heirs. At first, the shift was subtle enough that even I tried to excuse it. My formal title stalled. I was doing the work of operations director, strategy lead, donor risk analyst, and emergency program architect all at once. But Lucinda insisted titles should remain fluid because the foundation was still growing into itself. Somehow Bennett's title was never fluid. He went from director to executive chair with a dinner and a photographer. I went from indispensable to vaguely referred to. Then came the introductions. The earliest version was, "This is my wife, Corinne. She's been instrumental." That wasn't enough. But it was still recognizably human. Then it became, "Corinne helps us keep everything moving." Then, "Corinne is wonderful behind the scenes." Then Lucinda's preferred version. Always delivered with a warm little smile that made correction look gauche. "Corinne has such a gift for supporting the family mission." Supporting the family mission. That phrase followed me through board dinners, donor coffees, municipal briefings, and private receptions. Every time someone asked a question that pointed toward authorship, Lucinda translated me sideways until I sounded adjacent to my own work. If I presented the numbers, Bennett summarized the vision. If I built the model, Lucinda praised my organizational care. If a trustee thanked me directly, one of them stepped in before the gratitude could settle properly. It was never loud. That was the genius of it. They didn't try to humiliate me in ways that could be easily quoted back. They humiliated me by making me increasingly unnameable inside my own labor. Publicly, I became support. Privately, I was still the one Bennett came to when donors started asking intelligent questions and Lucinda's old social instincts proved useless against actual governance. I remember one night in particular. There had been a problem with the youth housing partnership funds delayed. Landlord pushback. A legal language issue in the intake documentation. Bennett was pacing the study in his shirt sleeves, sweating through the collar, saying things like, "Why is this suddenly so complicated?" As if systems emerge from the ground pre-organized and women invent complexity by noticing what men missed. I sat at his desk until 2 in the morning. Rewrote the intake language. Restructured the funding release sequence. And drafted the email that kept the city from pausing the entire partnership. At Doi, Shoptisprezecha. M. Bennett bent down, kissed the top of my head, and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." He meant it. That's what makes men like him so infuriating. They are often sincere in private right up until sincerity costs them public scale. The next morning at the board check-in, "With the crisis resolved because I had resolved it," he said. Mom and I were up late rethinking the rollout architecture. Mom and I sat 3 seats away. Lucinda nodded like royalty, confirming whether. I said nothing. That silence became part of the structure too, because every time I let it pass for the sake of the mission, the marriage, the board, the program, the children in housing transition, the scholarship cycle, the donor confidence. Every time I chose the work over my own public authorship, they learned the same lesson. Corinne will keep the engine running even if we remove her from the dashboard. And once people learn that about you, they stop seeing your humility as dignity. They start seeing it as available space. By the time of the gala, I had already been quietly demoted in every visible way that mattered. My email signature had been changed from Strategic Operations Director to Program and Family Liaison after Lucinda's office standardized communications. My quote had been cut from the annual impact report. My name had been dropped from the foundation timeline in the printed donor booklet draft, then reinserted only in 6-point type near the back under Special Acknowledgements. Special Acknowledgements. For work that kept the place solvent, compliant, and credible. That was the setup. That was the real condition of the marriage by the time I stood under that projection screen. Not a wife being suddenly mistreated out of nowhere. A woman whose value had already been siphoned into family mythology so thoroughly that the people closest to her now believed they could display the institution publicly without displaying her at all. And the worst part? Bennett still expected me to smile. The actual humiliation did not come from the screen. Not even from the donor reel. That was the setup. The real insult arrived 7 minutes later. In front of 3 trustees. 2 city council wives. A venture philanthropist from Chicago. And a local reporter, Lucinda, had spent the entire cocktail hour trying to charm into calling the Vale Foundation the city's moral crown. I know the timing because I looked at the clock above the west staircase when Bennett said it. 7 minutes after I learned they had erased me from the public archive. My husband looked me in the face and tried to turn my disappearance into etiquette. Naomi Sloan and I had moved away from the projection wall toward the champagne bar. Partly because she understood instinctively that I needed a better angle on the room. And partly because she knew Lucinda's surveillance always worked in circles. If we stayed still too long, Lucinda would drift near us, smiling. If we moved, she would assume we were containing ourselves like reasonable women. "Do you want me to pull the original deck metadata?" Naomi asked quietly. That was the thing about Naomi. Once she understood, a lie had matured into strategy. She stopped speaking socially. "Yes," I said. She nodded once and pulled out her phone. Then Bennett appeared. Of course he did. He had that infuriating gift weak men sometimes have for approaching a scene just after the damage but before the witnesses multiply too much. He came toward us, smiling for the room. Not for me. Black tuxedo. Foundation, crest on the lapel. Donor-level ease in every line of his body. If you didn't know him, you would think he was coming over to check on his wife with tenderness. I knew better. "Corinna," he said softly. As if I had misplaced my mood and he had come to help me find it. "You vanished." I stared at him. Not dramatically. Just long enough that the smile in his eyes had to decide whether to keep pretending. "You removed me from the Founder Archive reel," I said. Naomi did not move. Bennett's face stayed perfectly arranged. Then he gave the tiny exhale men give when they are about to explain your own life back to you in smaller words. "It wasn't personal," he said. That line should be illegal. Because what people mean when they say it wasn't personal is usually, "I hurt you through structure." And I'd prefer the elegance of that hurt to exempt me from accountability. I looked past him. Lucinda was 30 feet away, laughing at something one of the trustees had said. But not so hard she couldn't monitor us. Of course she had sent him first. The son to soften. The mother to ratify later. Naomi slipped her phone into her clutch and said, "I'm going to check on something," then walked away without looking back. Bless her for that. Bennett lowered his voice further. Mom thought the reel needed to stay focused on the family line. It's a legacy event. Family line. There it was. The polished version of bloodline supremacy. I said. I built half this foundation. He gave me that expression I had come to hate more than open cruelty, the patient face of a man preparing to call your injury impractical. "You've done a lot for us," he said. For us. Not for the foundation. Not for the women housed because I rebuilt the disbursement model. Not for the scholarship recipients who got funded because I tore up Lucinda's donor-friendly rubric and replaced it with something ethically defensible. For us. I could have slapped him then. Not because I wanted violence. Because my body briefly mistook contempt for motion. Instead, I said, "That reel was a lie. Bennett." In the middle of a ballroom built on marble money and family mythology. With donors turning slowly enough to pretend they weren't listening. Said the sentence that burned the whole structure down. "Corinna. No one here wants to see the operations wife inserted into the legacy narrative." Operations wife. Inserted. Legacy narrative. Even now. Writing it. I can feel the cold that came over me. Because all at once, every soft reduction finally took its true shape. I wasn't a partner they had minimized by habit. I was an intrusion they had tolerated by utility. An operations wife. As if my years of strategy, compliance, emergency intervention, financial restructuring, and architectural program design had been some kind of clerical extension of marriage. As if I had wandered into authorship by proximity and now needed to be reminded where tasteful women belong once the cameras come out. I didn't respond fast enough for him. That unsettled him. He pressed on, sensing what he thought was weakness. "This is exactly the kind of thing you make worse by reacting emotionally," he said. Please don't embarrass us tonight. Us. There it was again. And because cruelty always attracts the wrong audience. One of the city council wives, Janine Hollowell. Pearls? Lacquered smile. Husband on zoning had drifted close enough to hear the last line. She gave me a look of sympathetic superiority and said, "These family foundations can be so delicate. Better to support than compete." Compete. I turned to her. Then to Bennett. And before I could say a word, Lucinda arrived. Perfect timing. Perfect posture. One hand, carrying a champagne coupe like elegance itself, had asked her to model conflict resolution. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Smiling to the room. No concern in it. Only choreography. Bennett answered before I could. "Corinne's upset about the reel," he said, with a little laugh meant to shrink me into manageability. "She thinks she should have been featured more prominently." More prominently? God. Lucinda touched my arm as if consoling me, and said, clearly enough for Janine, the trustee couple, and the reporter 10 feet away to hear. "Darling, support roles are noble, but legacy isn't something you add yourself into." That was the insult beyond repair. Not private. Not deniable. Not even elegantly cruel anymore. A public declaration that I was support. Not source. That I had no standing to claim place in what I had built. That bloodline outranked labor. Marriage did not equal authorship. And my usefulness would always be acceptable only if it remained invisible under the family crest. The reporter looked down too fast, which meant she had heard every word. Janine Hollowell gave a tiny, satisfied nod. Bennett did not correct his mother. Of course he didn't. Because this exact stripping, this exact reduction, this exact public resizing of me under donor light was not Lucinda going too far. It was the point. I looked at all three of them then. Lucinda with her soft hand still on my arm. Bennett with his donor smile. Janine with her little pearl-studded approval. And I understood something so clean it felt like violence. They did not think I was going to fight back. They thought they had already named me small enough that the room would do the rest. I did not slap Lucinda's hand away. That was the first thing I denied them. Because that was what they wanted now. Not truth. Not resolution. A reaction. A visible female fracture they could call proof. If I had jerked away from her touch. If I had raised my voice. If I had turned to Bennett and said the first 10 honest things in my mouth. The room would have reorganized instantly around their preferred version of events. Poor Bennett. Difficult, Corinne. Lucinda trying so gracefully to calm everyone down. That is the oldest aristocratic trick in the book. Wound the woman. Then let her bleeding become the problem. No. Not tonight. So I let Lucinda's fingers rest on my arm for 1 second longer than dignity seemed to allow. Then I smiled not warmly. Not brightly. Just enough to give the room nothing usable and said, "Of course." That unsettled Bennett immediately. Because men like him can read anger. They can manage tears. They can survive a public confrontation if they know how to wear concern better than you wear injury. What they cannot manage is a woman who goes still. Lucinda's smile sharpened a fraction. Janine Hollowell relaxed too soon. The trustee couple drifted away. The reporter lifted her champagne flute and pretended to become interested in a nearby floral installation. Around us. The gala resumed its breathing. String quartet. Soft donor laughter. The machinery of prestige restarting around the insult, as if social grace could retroactively make it less ugly. Bennett leaned in and murmured, "Thank you. Thank you. For not embarrassing him. For swallowing the knife politely. For staying useful." I looked at him and said, very softly, "Don't thank me yet." Then I walked away. Not quickly. Not stiffly. I did not flee the room. I crossed it the way I had crossed 100 foundation evenings before measured. Composed. Impossible to accuse of drama. Past the donor wall. Past the silent auction display. past the trustee cluster near the east staircase. I felt eyes on me. Of course. Not all of them hostile. Some curious. Some embarrassed. Some, perhaps, finally beginning to register that what had just happened had not been a family disagreement but a public ranking. I did not turn back. Naomi was waiting near the service corridor. She took one look at my face and stopped pretending this was salvageable. "How bad?" she asked. I gave one short laugh. "She called me a support role to a reporter." Naomi's mouth flattened. Then she said the most beautiful sentence anyone had said to me that evening. I pulled the archived versions. That was my retreat. Not collapse. Not surrender. Repositioning. She handed me her phone. On the screen were 3 thumbnail files from the Foundation's presentation archive server. The current Gala reel, a version from 6 weeks earlier, and an older internal deck from the year before. I didn't need to open them yet to understand what that meant. Lucinda and Bennett had not merely kept the focus on family line. They had edited. Deliberately, progressively, quietly. Record. That's what people like them always forget to fear. I asked. "Can you get the board packet attachments too?" Naomi nodded. Already did. Of course she had. Together we stepped into the service corridor, where the sound of the gala dimmed into silverware and HVAC hum. White catering walls. Utility carts. Stacked linen crates. The unglamorous intestines of a beautiful event. I have always preferred the back end of institutions. That's where truth lives. Out front. You get chandeliers and bloodline. In the service hall, you get wiring. Naomi opened the files. The oldest deck listed me correctly under strategic development and program architecture. The middle version reduced me to operational coordination. The current Gala reel erased me entirely. There it was. Not oversight. Trajectory. They had been cutting me downward in stages so no single omission would feel large enough to fight until the final public version arrived, looking inevitable. I felt something inside me settle. Not break. Settle. Because once a pattern becomes visible, pain turns into structure. And structure is easier to defeat than confusion. Bennett texted me then. "Where did you go? Mom says we need to get ahead of this." I showed Naomi the message. She snorted once. "Get ahead of what? Your existence?" "Exactly." I typed back, taking a breath. "Back soon." That bought me time. That also reassured him. Which mattered more? If Bennett thought I was off crying in a powder room or calming down under maternal instruction, he'd stay sloppy. If Lucinda thought I had retreated into decorum, she would keep moving through the room like a victor. People like them only become careful once they smell counter-design. I had no intention of letting them smell it yet. Naomi pulled up the Foundation's internal authorship logs next. My edits. My document history. Revision chains tied to my credentials. Board memo drafts in my language later reissued under Bennett's name. Emergency housing restructuring notes. Scholarship redesign files. Donor migration plans. It was all there. Years of invisible architecture sitting in clean metadata while Lucinda stood 30 yards away in ivory silk telling the room legacy was not something I could add myself into. "I should tell you," I cried then. I didn't. Not because I was strong. Because fury, when it cools correctly, becomes precision. I asked Naomi one question. "Who has access to the AV booth tonight?" She blinked once, then smiled. Not kindly. Appreciatively. "Elias Mercer." "Technically," she said. He signed off on the board reel package because Lucinda insisted finance oversight made it look responsible. Elias. Dry. Skeptical. Impossible to flatter Elias Mercer. That was useful. I handed Naomi her phone back. Then I looked at my own reflection in the dark service door window, midnight blue gown. Bare shoulders. Face composed enough to pass. Eyes finally clear. Bennett and Lucinda thought they had just reduced me into silence. They were right. They just misunderstood what I use silence for. I wasn't leaving the gala. I was leaving the version of me they thought would keep protecting them. And when I walked back into that ballroom, I wasn't going in as Bennett's wife or Lucinda's polished little support structure anymore. I was going in as the person who had built the systems, retrieved the record, and finally stopped confusing dignity with compliance. The first layer of truth was authorship, not marriage, not loyalty, not support, authorship. That distinction mattered more than Bennett or Lucinda would ever understand. Because people like them survive by turning a woman's structural labor into emotional scenery. Wife. Help. Warmth. Instinct. Calm. Taste. Family glue. They wrap competence in soft language until the room forgets it ever had a spine. But metadata does not care about charm. Archive logs do not care about bloodline. And internal revision history is gloriously indifferent to silk. Surnames. And donor smiles. Standing in that service corridor with Naomi Sloane's phone in my hand, looking at file after file that traced the foundation's actual growth through my drafts, my edits, my authorship logs, I felt the first hard clarity of the night settle into place. They had not merely underappreciated me. They had reverse-engineered a public version of the institution in which I had never been central enough to claim. That required planning. The oldest archived deck Naomi showed me still listed me correctly. Strategic Development and Program Architecture, Corinne Vale. I had to look at that line twice. Not because I'd forgotten the truth. Because I had gotten too used to being translated downward. When people erase you slowly enough, seeing the accurate language again can feel almost foreign. Like hearing your own voice played back at the right pitch after years of bad speakers. The second version reduced me to operational coordination. The third erased me completely. That was the trajectory. Not a mistake. A sequence. And once you see sequence, you start spotting intent everywhere else too. I asked Naomi to open the board packet drafts from the previous year. There it was again. My original memo on restructuring the emergency housing fund, rewritten in the final version, so that my analysis appeared under Bennett's chair remarks, while Lucinda's introductory paragraph framed the shift as a natural extension of long-standing Vale family values. Natural extension. God. I had built an entirely new disbursement model after discovering the old one prioritized donor-pleasing optics over stabilization outcomes. I had rewritten the eligibility logic, added a crisis override mechanism, built the reporting protocol, and negotiated 2 city-side adjustments that stopped the whole program from collapsing under bureaucratic lag. And, in the public-facing packet, my work had become a natural extension of Lucinda's values. I should thank her for one thing. Women like Lucinda are so committed to aristocratic elegance that they almost always leave behind very clean evidence. The second layer of truth was financial. This one surprised even Naomi. I asked her to pull the founding budgets, not just the presentation decks. If Bennett and Lucinda had been willing to revise authorship in the story, I wanted to know whether they had also buried authorship in the numbers. They had tried, but they weren't good enough. The early operational budgets still carried my forecasting templates, my line notes, my vendor corrections, my donor risk flags. More importantly, the first serious bridge period, the stretch when the foundation moved from decorative charity into actual programming, had been stabilized, partly through a personal liquidity transfer from me. Not from Bennett. Not from Lucinda. Me. I had almost forgotten how plainly it was documented. 3 years earlier, when a municipal reimbursement delay collided with a donor pledge gap and a contractor invoice problem Lucinda insisted was surely temporary. I had moved money fast to keep the youth housing program from defaulting publicly in its first quarter. Not because I wanted heroics. Because if it failed then, the girls in transitional placement would have paid first. And I could not live with that. Bennett had called me a lifesaver that week. Then 6 months later he referred to it at dinner as a family flexibility period. Family flexibility. No. It had been my money. My decision. my risk. And now there it was in the ledger chain. Nat, as a confession. Naomi looked at me over the phone screen and said, very softly, they weren't just minimizing you. They were laundering origin. Exactly. That was the third layer. Not ego alone. Conversion. Turning concrete contributions into atmosphere until bloodline could wear them. Once I understood that fully, a dozen other moments snapped into focus. The title change from Strategic Operations Director to Program and Family Liaison. The quote, removal in the annual report. Bennett forwarding my donor risk memos from his address instead of mine. Lucinda insisting I sit at side tables because operational people look too busy at center tables. Even the board introductions made sense now. They had been training the room, conditioning donors, trustees, and reporters to associate me with usefulness. Not authorship. Warmth. Not architecture. Presence. Not origin. So by the time the gala reel aired, the lie was already socially pre-softened. That was the real cunning of it. If you erase a woman suddenly, people notice. If you reduce her in stages, they call it branding. Naomi handed me one final gift then. The original Gala deck submission log. The current public reel had been uploaded from Lucinda's office credentials. But the deck it replaced, the one removed 48 hours earlier, still existed in archive. It named me. Not enough. Not fully. But enough to prove recent deletion. Not long settled focus. Recent deletion is a beautiful kind of evidence. Because it destroys nostalgia. No one gets to claim. That's simply how the family story has always been told. No. It was altered this week. Before the gala, after invites were out, after donor language was locked, someone made a choice with a timeline attached. I looked at the service door window again and saw my reflection. But sharper now. Less wife. More witness. Bennett texted again. Mom is asking where you are. We need to be unified tonight. Unified. I smiled for the first time since the reel began. Because that word told me he still didn't understand the scale of his mistake. He thought this was about smoothing a marital bruise before the keynote. He thought unified meant I would return to the ballroom, swallow the insult, and stand where I was placed so the family crest could continue floating over the body of my work. He still thought I was deciding whether to be hurt. I was past hurt. I was indexing. And once a woman like me stops trying to save the people erasing her, she becomes very difficult to manage with etiquette. I texted back, on my way. Then I looked at Naomi and asked, can Elias Mercer get the AVQ changed without Lucinda's approval once the live program starts? Naomi's smile this time was not sympathetic. It was admiring. Yes, she said. If he thinks it's a governance issue. Good. Because thanks to Bennett and his mother, it now was. They had spent years making me sound smaller than the work. Tonight, for the first time, I had the full record in my hand. And the record said something much more dangerous than Corinne helped. It said the institution they were calling legacy had passed through me in ways neither of them could survive being forced to deny publicly. The panic in Bennett did not show up as fear. Not at first. It showed up as managerial tenderness. That is how soft men from hard families unravel in public. They start trying to handle the woman they've misjudged before they realize the room is no longer theirs to manage. When I returned to the ballroom from the service corridor, Bennett spotted me almost immediately. Of course he did. He had spent the last 10 minutes believing he was waiting for a wife to calm down. What he was actually waiting for was a systems architect carrying the archive of his mother's vanity and his own cowardice in one hand. He crossed the floor toward me, smiling. Wrong move. Because people notice when a husband has to intercept his wife during a gala after the wife has gone missing from the founder reel and then gone physically missing herself. Donors are animals in formal wear. They can smell disturbance through orchids. There you are, he said. Low and warm and false. Mom's about to open the live appeal. Can we please do this tomorrow? Tomorrow. That word almost made me laugh. The favorite refuge of people who only discover privacy after public cruelty starts threatening them back. I looked at him and said, "Do what tomorrow?" His jaw shifted. The smile stayed. "Barely. You know what I mean," he murmured. "Don't turn this into a scene." There it was again. Scene. Every injustice a woman names in the wrong room becomes a scene to the people who engineered it. Across the ballroom, Lucinda had already repositioned herself near the podium. Ivory silk. Champagne coupe. Trusty cluster forming around her like she generated gravity rather than just entitlement. If Bennett was the velvet glove, Lucinda was the hand that had forgotten it ever needed one. Naomi slipped past me then, heading toward the west side of the room with the unobtrusive pace of a woman who knew exactly what her face should reveal and what it must not. Elias Mercer had just arrived near the AV console with a board packet tucked under one arm. Good. Very good. The room was beginning to arrange itself. That's the thing about escalation when it's done correctly. It does not feel like chaos to the person executing it. It feels like alignment. One donor, standing in the right place. One board member close enough to hear. One screen still trusted by the room. One weak husband still assuming he is early enough to contain you. Bennett touched my elbow. I moved my arm away. Not sharply. Just enough. His eyes flicked down. That was the first visible crack. "Corinne," he said. "Lower now. Less husband. More threat disguised as concern. I am asking you not to embarrass this family tonight." Family. That word again. Always family when they need your silence. Never family when it is time to name your work. I said. "You already handled the embarrassment." He blinked. Then, because weakness always seeks reinforcement. He glanced instinctively toward Lucinda. That glance told me everything. Not because I needed more proof he was her son before he was my husband. I already had that. But because it showed me he was no longer sure which script would save him. The calm one. The angry one. The loving one. The dutiful son one. Men like Bennett only look polished as long as the women around them keep choosing coherence on their behalf. I had stopped. At the podium, Lucinda tapped a spoon lightly against her glass. The room softened toward her immediately. Of course it did. Lucinda had spent 30 years training rooms to move when she made sound. "Friends," she said, smiling as the quartet fell quiet. "Before we begin our live pledge segment, I just want to say how moving it is to see this room gathered in the spirit of legacy." Legacy. She kept choosing that word because she believed repetition becomes ownership. People turned toward the stage. Trustees angled their shoulders. Servers stilled. The reporter near the floral installation lifted her chin slightly. And there, behind Lucinda on the 12-foot screen, the founder reel froze on a photograph of her and Bennett standing beneath the foundation crest like hereditary virtue had come in coordinated eveningwear. Bennett stepped back from me then. That was the second crack. He wanted to look uninvolved now. To drift toward the stage and become son again. To separate himself just enough that whatever happened next might still be framed as women's conflict. But distance only works when the room has not already seen you intercept your wife like a handler. I saw Janine Hollowell whisper something to the trustee beside her. I saw Elias Mercer take a file from Naomi, without looking at her directly. I saw the AV technician frown at the console. "Good." Lucinda kept speaking. "This foundation," she said, "has always been built by family hands, guided by family values, and protected by family sacrifice." There it was. Always. The kind of lie that only works if nobody with records stands up in time. My phone vibrated once in my clutch. "Naomi." Elias saw the archive trail. "He's furious. Waiting for your signal." I looked up at the screen again. Lucinda's face, 20 times larger than life, was illuminated above the room while she narrated inheritance over the body of my work. I should tell you my heart was pounding. It was, but not from fear. From accuracy. There is a specific bodily sensation that comes when the truth has finally become organized enough to act. It does not feel messy. It feels almost mathematical. Bennett must have sensed something then, because he moved back toward me too quickly and whispered, "What did you do?" Beautiful. Not what are you doing? What did you do? Past tense. Instinctive. Already guilty. I met his eyes and said, "I stopped helping you look original." At the podium, Lucinda raised her glass. "To the Vale legacy," and at that exact moment, the screen behind her flickered once. Just once. Tiny enough that only the watchful people noticed. Elias Mercer stepped closer to the AV console. The technician looked at him, then at the board packet in his hand, then back at the frozen image of Lucinda and Bennett. Bennett turned fully now, all the blood draining out of his face at once. Because weak men often understand the scale of disaster 1 second before elegant women do. Lucinda kept smiling at the room. She had no idea yet. But Bennett did. And when my husband finally understood that this was no longer an argument, no longer a wife with hurt feelings, no longer a mother's polished correction of a daughter-in-law who forgot her place, I saw the first true panic of the night appear in him. Not fear of me. Fear of record. The reveal began with a black screen. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind people in movies gasp at. Just a brief, inelegant drop to black behind Lucinda Vale, while she stood at the podium in ivory silk. Glass raised. Smiling into the room as if legacy were something one could inherit morally, simply by saying the word often enough. "To the Vale legacy," she began. Then the screen blinked out. A few donors turned automatically. The quartet hesitated. The AV technician swore under his breath. Too softly for most people to hear. But I was close enough to catch the panic in it. Lucinda's smile held for one beat, then sharpened around the edges. And when the image came back, it was not her reel. It was the archive log. Clean white slide. Black text. No music. No soft focus family photos. No crest. Just a file trail. Vale Foundation Founding Deck Revision History. Version 11. 2. Corinne Vale listed under Strategic Development and Program Architecture. Version 12. 0. Corinne Vale reduced to operational coordination. Version 13. For current Gala presentation. Corinne Vale removed. The room went still so quickly it felt like someone had vacuumed the sound out of the chandeliers. Lucinda did not turn around immediately. That was almost funny. She kept smiling at the room because women like her spend decades believing composure can outvote evidence. Somewhere in her mind, this was surely a technical hiccup. A slide error. Something her son or the AV staff or one of the foundation interns could smooth over before anyone really registered what was happening. But the room had already registered it. I saw it in the board members first. Elias Mercer had that dry tax lawyer face gone completely glacial. Arms folded now. No longer pretending any of this might still be a harmless branding disagreement. Then the trustees. Then the donor cluster near Janine Hollowell. Then the reporter, who had stopped even pretending to sip her champagne. And finally Bennett. Bennett saw the screen and turned the color of skim milk. Lucinda followed the shift in his face and looked back. That was the moment I will keep forever. Not because she screamed. She didn't. Not because she dropped the glass. She didn't. Lucinda Vale had too much training for visible collapse that early. But her eyes widened. Just enough. Because for the first time all night, she was not controlling the story. She was standing inside its correction. The next slide appeared. Document authorship summary. Emergency Housing Restructure Proposal. Primary drafter. Corinne Vale. Scholarship Evaluation Matrix Primary Designer. Corinne Vale. Municipal Youth Partnership Framework Originating Strategy Memo. Corinne Vale. Donor Migration and Compliance Recovery Plan. Lead author. Corinne Vale. No commentary. No adjectives. That was the beauty of it. Nothing enrages narcissists like records written in neutral language. If I had taken the microphone and said, "I built this foundation while they used me and erased me," half the room would still have tried to call it a marital crisis in couture. But there, 10 feet high behind Lucinda's body, were the words that do not ask permission from bloodline. Primary drafter. Primary designer. Originating strategy. Lead author. The architecture of the lie was collapsing in public. Bennett reached me then. Too late. Of course. What did you do? He hissed. I didn't look at him. I stopped letting your mother narrate my labor as heredity. That was when Lucinda found her voice. There seems to be some internal material on the wrong feed, she said smoothly into the microphone. Internal material. Wrong feed. Still trying. Still convinced she could aestheticize her way out of evidence. But before she could gesture for the AV tech to cut it, Elias Mercer stepped forward from the side of the room and said, loudly enough for every donor table to hear, no. Leave it. Now that was beautiful. Because Elias was not emotional. Not dramatic. Not mine. Which meant the room heard what he said as governance. Not grievance. Lucinda Frozi. The third slide rose behind her. Foundational financial bridge period. Temporary liquidity support source. Corinne Vale. Noted in internal recovery budget as family flexibility period in later revision. That one broke the room open. Not loudly. Rich rooms do not burst open. They separate. You could see it happen table by table. Body by body. The older donor couple near the west aisle leaned away from the stage. Janine Hollowell's polished sympathy collapsed into horror. The city council wives were no longer smiling. One trustee actually set her program down like it had become contaminated. And Bennett, my husband, the man who once kissed my forehead after I saved his foundation from imploding and then let his mother turn my money into family flexibility, took one involuntary step backward. That was the reveal. Not that I helped. Not that I had been undervalued. That the institution they were calling legacy had been structurally, financially, and strategically stabilized through me while they systematically revised the public narrative to turn my labor into family atmosphere. The final slide hit hardest because it named the mechanism. External title revision log. Original. Strategic Operations Director. Revised. Program and Family Liaison. Approved by Lucinda Vale. Bennett Vale. Approved by. There it was. No confusion. No misunderstanding. No, Corinne's upset about the real. Approved by. My husband and his mother stood beneath a screen, publicly documenting that they had downgraded my title, erased my authorship, converted my funding into family mystique, and removed me from the founding narrative of the foundation I helped build. And then, because truth sometimes gifts you one final miracle, the reporter raised her phone. Not discreetly. Openly. Lucinda saw it. Bennett saw it. Everyone saw it, which meant this was no longer a room problem. It was a record problem. I stepped forward then. Not to the podium. Not yet. Just far enough into the center aisle that the room had to make space for me physically, the way they had refused to do narratively. Lucinda still held the microphone. Her knuckles were white around it now. I looked at her. Then at Bennett. Then at the 12-foot proof of their edits glowing over both their bodies. And said the only sentence the night had ever really required. You didn't forget me. Silence. Then I finished it. You removed me. Lucinda's collapse began in her face. Not dramatically. That would have been too human. No. What happened first was much worse for a woman like her. The expression slipped. The smile stayed in place for half a second after the room had already stopped believing in it. And in that fraction of time, everyone could see the machinery underneath. Not elegance. Not stewardship. Not family dignity under pressure. Control. Ugly. Naked control. She still held the microphone when I said, You didn't forget me. You removed me. And for one suspended beat, no one moved. Then Bennett tried the oldest weak man instinct in the world. Am I Corinna? He said, stepping forward with both palms slightly open, as if I were the unstable variable here. This is not the way to handle. Elias Mercer cut him off. I think, he said coolly, we are past pretending this is a handling issue. Beautiful. Because that was the thing Bennett feared most, not anger. Not even exposure. But competent men refusing to frame his mother's manipulation as a private family matter. Once Elias moved it into governance language, Bennett lost his favorite shelter. Lucinda recovered just enough to try one final lie. These are internal working materials, she said into the microphone. Her voice smooth but thinner now. Like any institution, we refine language over time. Corinne is taking a preliminary draft far too personally. Refine language. There it was again. That bloodless aristocratic phrasing, as if title reduction, authorship laundering, and public erasure were all just matters of tone. I heard someone near the front table say, "Oh my God," not loudly, but loud enough. And then the room stopped protecting her. That was the actual collapse. Not the screen. Not my sentence. The room choosing. The older donor couple near the west aisle physically turned their chairs away from the stage. Janine Hollowell, who had nodded approvingly when Lucinda called me support, now looked like she wanted to dissolve into her pearls. Two board members were already whispering urgently over their printed programs. The reporter wasn't even pretending anymore. Her phone was held chest-high now, pointed straight toward the podium. Lucinda saw all of it. You could tell by the way her grip on the microphone tightened. Bennett tried again. But panic had entered him now. And panic makes polished men stupid. This is all being wildly mischaracterized, he said. Too fast. Too loud. Corinne has always been part of the family effort. But there are boundaries around legacy representation and legacy representation. I almost laughed. Because there he stood. Under a screen documenting title manipulation, authorship removal, and financial revision. Still trying to sound like the victim of improper framing. Elias did laugh. One short, incredulous sound. Legacy representation, he repeated. You downgraded her title, erased her authorship, and reclassified her financial bridge contribution as family flexibility. That phrase hit the room hard. Family flexibility. Now that it had been said aloud by someone who wasn't me, it sounded exactly as grotesque as it was. Bennett's mouth actually opened and closed before any words came out. He looked to Lucinda. Of course he did. And that was his collapse in miniature. A husband accused publicly of erasing his wife. Turning instantly toward his mother for instruction. The room saw it. That mattered. Because before tonight, Bennett had survived by looking like the inheritor of moral seriousness. Calm son, thoughtful chair, clean-handed steward of a family mission. But once the room saw him defer reflexively to Lucinda while standing in the wreckage of his own approvals, he no longer looked like leadership. He looked managed. Lucinda understood that too late. So she did what women like her do when they sense social rank failing. She tried to turn dignity into aggression. Corinne, she said, dropping the microphone slightly and looking at me as if I were a maid who had started speaking over dinner. Whatever role you have played in this organization, this spectacle is beneath you. Whatever role. There it was. Even now. Even with the records behind her. Even with the room watching, she could not say what I had actually done. To name it would be to surrender hierarchy. So she reached for contempt instead. I stepped closer. Not to the stage. Just enough that my voice didn't have to climb to meet hers. What's beneath me? I said. Is being used to build an institution and then edited out of it by people too weak to admit they needed me. That landed. Not because it was clever. Because it was exact. One trustee, Marcia Bell, who years ago had said, the youth housing wing felt like my mind actually stood up from her table. She looked at Lucinda first. Then at Bennett. Then at the screen. And said, clearly, is any of this untrue? That was the question neither of them could survive. Not socially. Not structurally. Not legally. If it kept going. Lucinda didn't answer. Bennett tried. This is about context. No. Marcia said. It's about truth. There. Done. Once another woman in the room refused Lucinda's framing and refused Bennett's smoothing. The hierarchy snapped. Suddenly, everyone was speaking in real words. Did she fund that bridge period? Who approved the title revision? Why was she removed 48 hours ago? Was the board told? The questions came from every direction now, trustees. Donors. One of the city partnership liaisons. Even a junior development officer who probably knew she'd regret speaking later but did it anyway, because some moments expose cowardice too broadly to hide behind. Lucinda turned toward the AV booth and said sharply, "Take that off the screen." But Elias had already stepped between the booth and the stage. "No," he said. "Just that." And because he was finance oversight, because he was old enough, and blunt enough, and unimpressed enough, no one challenged him. Lucinda's authority died right there. In a single denied command. Bennett saw it and made his worst mistake of the night. He turned on me fully and hissed, "Are you happy now?" That sentence sealed his fate. Because the whole room heard it. Not Corinne. "Can we fix this?" Not "I'm sorry." Not even "this got out of hand." "Are you happy now?" As if I had done something petty. As if public proof of their edits. Their approvals. Their theft of authorship. Their title reduction. Their conversion of my money into family myth was just a wife's vindictive little tantrum. The room recoiled from him. You could feel it. Lucinda closed her eyes for 1 second. Not in sorrow. In calculation. Too late. The event director was already moving toward the stage with 2 security staff hovering at a respectful distance. Unsure whether this was scandal or governance or family implosion in formal wear, Elias took the microphone from Lucinda's hand. She let him. That was the final collapse. He didn't even ask. And she let him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. "The live appeal is suspended, pending immediate board review of the archival and authorship materials now displayed." Suspended. At their own gala. Under their own crest. With donors. Trustees. Press. And city partners watching. Bennett looked like someone had pulled his bones out one by one. Lucinda looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not because she had aged. Because she had been measured. And for the first time in years, the room was no longer asking what the Vale family wanted it to see. It was looking directly at what they had done. The first thing I took back was not my marriage. It was my title. That mattered more. Because marriages built on distortion can still limp along in private for years if the woman inside them keeps mistaking love for endurance. But title, real authorship. Real, standing inside an institution that changes the shape of a room the moment it is restored correctly. The gala never resumed. That was delicious in a way I hadn't expected. Not because I wanted chaos for sport, but because Lucinda had designed that entire evening to freeze her family's mythology into public memory. She wanted photos. Donor quotes. Softened press coverage. Trustees in black tie, nodding solemnly, while the Vale name settled more deeply into the city's moral imagination. Instead, the event ended in suspension. No live appeal. No standing ovation. No triumphant final reel. Just a ballroom full of rich, careful people trying to decide how quickly they could leave without looking cowardly. Elias Mercer took charge in the way competent men do when a vanity structure suddenly reveals its wiring. He spoke briefly with the event director. Then with 2 board members. Then with the AV technician. No raised voice. No performance. Just instructions. Governance. Procedure. The kind of language Lucinda had spent years treating as decorative until it turned and bit her. Bennett kept trying to get me alone. Of course he did. Twice he moved toward me from the side of the room with that stricken, managerial look on his face. As if there might still be time to turn this into a marital conversation instead of the institutional reckoning it had already become. Twice someone intercepted him, not dramatically, just naturally. A trustee with a question. A donor asking whether the appeal had been cancelled. Elias once. With a document in hand and a look Bennett was not equipped to withstand. I stood near the west aisle with Naomi Sloan beside me and, for the first time in years, watched the foundation operate in a crisis, without needing me to keep the most important man in it emotionally comfortable. That was clarifying. Marcia Bell approached first. She did not hug me. Thank God. I would have hated that. She stood in front of me. Silver hair. Nave silk. Spine like a verdict. And said, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me theirs. I said. No. She replied. But I owe you mine for not seeing it earlier. That landed. Because she was right. The board had not created the theft. But they had benefited from the ease of not naming the woman doing the structural work under the family crest. People always think erasure is powered only by villains. Usually it's powered just as much by bystanders who find the lie socially convenient. Then Elias came over. He did not waste words. The board will be requesting every title revision, archive edit, and authorship log from the last 4 years, he said, including financial bridge documentation. There it was. Not sympathy. Not scandal. Record. He looked at me directly. For the record, should your role have remained Strategic Operations Director? Should have remained. I felt something inside me go still, in the cleanest possible way. Yes, I said. And several board memoranda were originally drafted from my office before being reissued under Bennett's. He nodded once. Like a man adding a beam back into a frame. Understood. That was the moment my place began returning to me in real time, not through applause, but through correct institutional language. No more Corinne the help. Corinne the wife. Corinne the support role. Corinne the family liaison. Not the upholstered feminine version Lucinda preferred because it kept inheritance looking self-generated. My actual role. My actual work. My actual standing. Bennett reached me after that. He had lost something essential by then. Not his tuxedo polish. Not his good jawline or his donor-trained voice. Those things remain on a man long after the room stops respecting them. What he had lost was social gravity. The space around him no longer bent. Can we go somewhere private? He asked. No. Just that. His face changed. Briefly. A flicker of injury. As if my refusal were the cruelty in the room. Corinne. Please. You've made your point. No. That was what men like Bennett never understand. A woman restoring the truth after prolonged erasure is not making a point. She is correcting authorship. I didn't make a point, I said. I stopped letting you wear mine. He actually flinched. Good, because they're beneath chandeliers and donor portraits and the last dying embers of his mother's social reign. He finally had to hear himself accurately. Not as a husband caught in the middle. Not as a good son pressured by a difficult matriarch. As a man who let his wife build the institution. Downgrade her title. Convert her money into family mythology. And then stand smiling while she was removed from the founding narrative of her own work. Lucinda did not come to me. That also mattered. She stayed near the stage under the supervision of 3 board women and 1 event director. Still upright. Still lacquered. Still trying to look as though she had chosen dignity rather than been denied power. But she did not cross the room. For the first time since I married into that family, Lucinda Vale could not summon me with a look. She had lost that authority. By the time I left Marlowe House, the screen was dark. The appeal suspended. The board in emergency review. And my phone contained copies of every document they had hoped I would never line up side by side. Outside. The night air felt cold and ordinary. Naomi squeezed my hand once before heading to her car. Elias called after me from the museum steps. Miss Vale tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Board council. Then he paused and corrected himself. Director Vale? There. That was it. That was the first clean piece of my name coming home. 6 weeks later. My name was back on the foundation records. Not as Bennett's wife. Not as family liaison. Not as support. Properly. Corinne Vale, Strategic Operations Director and Foundational Program Architect. Dry language. Clean language. The kind I trust now. Because truth gets safer when it stops trying to sound flattering. The board review moved faster than Lucinda expected and more brutally than Bennett could survive. Elias Mercer and outside counsel pulled the archive logs. Title revisions. Donor communications. Authorship trails. Internal financial memos. And presentation approvals. Once the sequence was laid out side by side, no amount of silk, inheritance, or wounded family rhetoric could protect them. The pattern was too clear. My title had been downgraded in stages. My authored material had been reissued under Bennett's office. My liquidity transfer during the bridge crisis had been reclassified into sentimental family language. And the Gala reel, Lucinda's masterpiece, had not merely omitted me. It had been manually revised 48 hours before the event to remove the last visible trace of my role from the public founding narrative. That timing killed them. Because families can survive accusations of old bias if they call it complexity, they do not survive clean evidence of recent deletion. Lucinda resigned from the board first. Of course, she dressed it up. Her statement cited a desire to preserve the dignity of the mission above personal distraction. That line would have almost impressed me if I hadn't spent years watching her confuse dignity with dominance. The local paper ran it anyway, followed immediately by a second paragraph noting that the resignation came after an internal review of authorship and title manipulation connected to the Gala materials. Perfect. Bennett tried to stay. That was almost embarrassing. For 1 full week. He moved through calls and emails and clarification meetings, as if this might still be survivable through tone. He said things like misalignment, communications drift, internal title confusion. He even tried once God help him to describe the Gala reveal as an unfortunate escalation of private marital tensions into institutional space. No. Elias shut that down in under a minute. This ceased being private. He told him in one meeting I attended. When you converted institutional record into family mythology and attached donor communications to the lie. Family mythology. There it was. Spoken aloud in a conference room instead of a ballroom. Which somehow made it even more devastating. Bennett lost the chair position 3 days later. No dramatic firing. No shouting. Just a vote. A statement. And a request that he step aside, pending full restructuring of governance roles. Men like him always expect ruin to look theatrical. They never understand that the worst consequence is often procedural. Being removed by minutes. Replaced by signatures. Outranked by record. As for me, they offered me the role I had already been doing for years. Formally this time. With the title restored. Salary corrected. Governance protections written in. Direct board reporting. Independent budget authority over the program branches I had built. Elias called it a necessary correction. Marcia Bell called it late. But not too late. I accepted. Not because I wanted to remain inside the house Lucinda built. Because by then it wasn't her house anymore. That is the difference between reclamation and nostalgia. I had no interest in returning to the old arrangement. No interest in becoming the tolerated genius behind a family crest. No interest in being loved privately and erased publicly. But the mission, the actual work, the women housed, the scholarships, the city partnerships, the things that mattered before Lucinda ever learned how to throw a gala around them, those were mine too. Maybe more mine than theirs. And I was no longer willing to leave my work behind, simply because weak people had wrapped themselves around it. Bennett came to the apartment once after the board vote. I had already changed the locks, not vindictively, logistically. It's amazing how clear certain decisions become once you stop arguing with yourself in the language of marriage and start making them in the language of infrastructure. He stood outside the door in a coat I bought him 2 Christmases earlier and said, "Through the wood. You don't have to do this." That line almost made me laugh. As if I were the one doing something abrupt. As if title theft, authorship laundering, public erasure, financial revision, and his mother's performance of bloodline supremacy had all just happened to him like weather. I opened the door far enough to see his face. Nothing more. And I said, "No. Bennett. I should have done this earlier." Then I closed it. That was the end of the marriage. Not with a scream. Not with a thrown glass. Not with a final speech to a man who had already spent years listening selectively. With a door. And on the other side of that door, something new began. 3 months after the gala, the foundation launched the revised emergency housing initiative under the structure I had originally designed. My name appeared on the internal architecture notes and the external implementation acknowledgement. Not oversized. Not sentimentalized. Just correctly placed. The donor wall was redesigned. The founder language was revised. The old, family legacy language disappeared from every serious document. It became what it always should have been, an institution with documented builders, accountable governance, and outcomes larger than surname. Sometimes people still ask about the gala. Not directly. Usually, they circle it. Mention the board transition. Mention Lucinda's resignation. Mention Bennett's absence. Mention how strong the foundation feels now. How unusually clean the reporting is. How much more serious the program work looks. I let them circle. Then, when necessary, I tell them the truth in one line. It got healthier when the real labor stopped pretending to be decorative. That is the new order. Lucinda no longer narrates the institution. Bennett no longer wears my work like inherited tailoring. And I no longer confuse being indispensable with being respected. The room changed. The record changed. I changed. They thought they could erase me because I was quiet. Because I was a wife. Because I understood systems better than spectacle. Because I cared more about the mission than the credit. They thought all of that made me safe to diminish. What it actually made me was dangerous once I stopped protecting them. Because people like Bennett and Lucinda only look powerful while the woman holding the structure still agrees to remain out of frame. I don't anymore. The gala was supposed to crown their legacy. Instead, it documented their fraud. And now the foundation stands on its real history. Under its real names. With its real architecture visible at last. Not theirs. Mine too.